What does a murderer look like?
Well, look in the mirror.
Bob Taylor is a former West Yorkshire Police Detective Chief Superintendent. He has an unprecedented 100% detection and conviction rate. This makes him one of the UK's most successful murder detectives.
You've got to rip the scene apart, which I did at Wendy Speakes' house. I absolutely tore that house to pieces.
During his 30-year career, Bob has worked on some of the country's biggest crime investigations, including the Yorkshire Ripper, the hunt for kidnapper Nicola Sands, and the murder of Wakefield woman Wendy Speakes.
This isn't a job that you can turn off at 5 o'clock, go home. It's going to live with you for weeks and haunt you until you actually get a result.
I'm Nicola Sands, and in this episode, Bob Taylor gives a fascinating insight into the mindset and motivation it takes to catch a killer. Bob, thanks so much for coming into the studio. That is quite a record, 100% detection and conviction rate, which statistically does make you the UK's most successful detective.
Yes, I believe it does. But then again, I did spend probably 26 of my 31 years in the police service in CID. So I had plenty of opportunity, but that's where my heart always was, in criminal investigation.
Let's take it back to the beginning. What was it that made you decide to go into the police force in the first place?
Well, I was working for my father's business, and I saw my mum working in the business. She was the company secretary, my dad, and I thought, we've got all our eggs in one basket here.
What was their business?
Plumbing and gas fitting and central heating.
Okay.
I mean, I have to say my dad taught me lots and lots of practical skills.
Yeah.
But we had a bit of a bad debt. It wasn't our fault. Company we'd subcontracted for went bust. So I decided I needed a bit of independence myself. Where I lived, there were two police officers lived in the street. One Leeds City Police, which I went on to join, and the other one was British Transport Police. And I was quite impressed by their demeanour. You know, I'd see them walking past the house. And one Saturday morning, I didn't say anything to my parents. I just went down and joined.
What was it about the police force that appealed to you?
Well, I think somebody said to me, you know, a police force is like, you know, cream. It always rises to the top. So if you have the skills, you should do okay. But we all join at the bottom level. So when I joined, you know, my aspirations were just to be a police constable. Never thought of anything else.
Was it quite easy for you to get a job there? Did they take you on straight away when you went in?
Oh, absolutely, because I'd got some GCSEs, so I didn't have to do the entrance exam. So the only thing that would have failed me is the medical. And I remember going for the medical, and all the Dr. Sinton, he said, roll your trousers up above your knees, lad. And which I did. I didn't know why. He looked at my legs, he said, you're fine. Apparently we're checking for varicose veins.
Really? It was that simple?
Yes. And I was in 13 weeks at training school and came back and posted to quite a notorious part of Leeds, the Gipton estate.
Wow.
And that's where I spent my first few years.
What stands out to you at that time? What cases were you working on around that time?
Well, you weren't as a PC, you were just responding to calls.
Okay.
So, you know, sometimes it was a race. If, you know, on nights, if an alarm went off, we'd all race there, you know, hopefully that there'd be a criminal to be caught. And I think that's where I thought, I quite like this. You know, I'm doing the files and taking people to court and interviewing them. So I started aspiring towards the Criminal Investigation Department, CID.
Did you have aspirations to be a detective at that time? Or quite quickly?
I didn't when I joined, but I quickly saw what I liked, and it was the work of the CID. And, you know, that we always looked up to them. You know, they were all plain clothes, and they were skilled officers. So I quickly sort of thought that's for me, and I got posted to Chapeltown, another notorious part of Leeds, and that's where I started my CID career.
And of course, at the beginning of your career, you were involved in one of the most notorious murder hunts of our time, the search for the Yorkshire Ripper. What do you remember about that?
I remember because I worked on the first one, Wilmer McCann. Although that wasn't in our divisional area, I worked on that for a few months. And then the next one, Emily Jackson, was in my division. And I was one of the first detectives on the scene. So I worked on that one all the way through.
What was it like working? I mean, that was such a huge investigation and a huge story in the media. What was it like for someone who's fairly new to the police force to be working on something like that?
It was incredible. It hadn't gained the impetus at that point. I think by the third murder, which was Irene Richardson, which I also went to the scene of, because I was the exhibit officer on Emily Jackson and Irene Richardson. So I went to the post-mortems and were quite involved in the investigation. By that time, people could see a pattern emerging. And, you could sense, because the ladies of the night were out in quite large numbers, and they started dwindling.
Yeah,
And,
prostitution was rife in that particular area of Leeds.
It was. I mean, in fairness, there were a lot who worked from home, so to speak, and just took clients at the homes, which obviously carried on without too much trouble. But fear roamed the streets, absolutely. And, we were so slowly being sucked into a beast of an investigation that was getting so unmanageable on a paper system, because as people may not recall,
there were no computers.
We didn't have any computers,
no mobile phones.
And as it grew and it grew, it would take one piece of paper 3 weeks to make its way through the system in the incident room. So that meant that any information on an individual that was on pieces of paper going through that system in that 3-week period wasn't available to the investigating officer. And, of course, that was the big difference that computerization gave us, that it'd tell you everything and exactly where that information was on an individual. That was the major setback. I mean, there were what I would consider some irrational decisions made by senior investigating officers, which I now would be critical of. And those were the mistakes that I learnt from, and made sure that I would never do that.
Do you feel that the fact that you worked on that Ripper investigation and saw some of the errors that were made, or some of the difficulties and the challenges, do you think that that all came together to make you a better detective in the long run?
Yes, I think because no two detectives are the same. And I think what you tend to do is you pick the good points from other detectives who taught you and other detectives who you've experienced working with, and you put those together in yourself. Like, you cannot make any assumptions. You have to follow the evidence. And if you're not following what the evidence is you've got, then you're probably going down the wrong road.
What was it like working on the Ripper investigation? Was it a frustrating feeling, or was it hugely exciting? How would you describe the feeling at the time for the people working on it like yourself?
It got so out of control because, bear in mind, there were 2 investigations. Each murder was individually investigated by one team, and then there was what was known as the Ripper team that were just taking all the inquiries that people were writing in saying, I think this is the Ripper is. And it was getting so unmanageable that what was an incident room that you could look from one end to the other and see perhaps a dozen people working at desks was just lines and lines of boxes with cards and paper in. And the biggest threat to life was that floor would collapse on the people on the floor below, because you just can't. An individual cannot, their brain cannot comprehend all the information on those cards, whereas a computer can give you everything at your fingertips that you want.
So if that investigation was carried out today, it would be very different, wouldn't it?
Well, it would. And one of the key things is that when they introduced the home system, which was a computerised system, the senior investigating officer has to write a policy log, which is critical, because a decision that you make, such as, I think those letters and tapes were from the killer, you would have to justify that. And we now know that it couldn't be justified, but it has to be justified in the policy log. We also have reviews, so people come along and review. So I'm always careful. And of course, in some of the cases I dealt with where I did receive letters, my force was rather keen that I could justify that those letters were from the killer.
So you started off as a PC, you worked on the Ripper inquiry. Were you actually promoted during that time, or was it at the end of that inquiry that you were promoted?
I was promoted while I was on the Irene Richardson murder. It was a sort of a pre-qualification to come back in CID. You had to have done a CID course, and I hadn't done mine. So they sent me off to Preston. And while I was on the course, I got promoted sergeant and was posted to Millgarth, Leeds City Centre. And it was later when I was posted back into CID as detective sergeant that I came back onto the Ripper cases. I worked on 5 in total, and the 3 at the back end.
Would you say they laid the foundations for your career in the police force, those 5 cases?
Yes, I think they have, because they taught me so much in terms of how you deal with your staff. Because when I worked on those Ripper cases, it was go eliminate people. Right, your job is to eliminate somebody, and of course you'd eliminate them because they didn't have a Geordie accent, and of course, as we know, he didn't have a Geordie accent. So if you're working on false criteria, you're never going to be successful.
So the reason that you were looking for someone with a Geordie accent was because of the hoax tape that was sent in, which senior police officer thought was genuine. Is that right?
Yes, he thought it was genuine, but I think we now know that it had no reasonable grounds for believing it was genuine, because all the information in the letters and tapes were actually in the public domain, which obviously we now know. So I'd rather take the view that your job as a detective is to investigate the crime, not go and eliminate people. You should be investigating. We should be actively looking for the person responsible. I mean, I have done, on some of them, I put in you need to set suspect criteria, elimination criteria. And in some, where I didn't have reasonable grounds to say it happened on between these hours, I've said this is an investigation. This is going to be implication, not elimination. But you've got to be proactive.
What do you think are the key things the key qualities that a good detective needs to have?
I think you have to be a team player, for one. You need to be knowledgeable on your subject, a good interviewer, good listener. You need to have a bit of a flair for, the criminal side of the investigation and everything that comes with it. And you need to have patience. it's not necessarily going to come on day one.
Well, you've worked on 150
Yes.
murder hunts and headed up several. Every single one of the ones you headed up was solved. When you're actually heading up an investigation, do you get completely immersed in it? Is it really hard to switch off?
You don't switch off. And, you know, I feel for my family because they suddenly are no longer the focus of my life. The focus of my life, and the last thing you think about when you're going to sleep is, have I missed something? Can I do something different tomorrow? I mean, I would read every statement, every file, and on occasions I've picked things up that other people have missed that have been crucial. So you live and breathe it, absolutely.
Very long days as well.
I probably wouldn't take a day off for 3 weeks.
Wow.
Because you want to be there. You'd want to be on top of the case. And, you know, if you haven't got it in 3 weeks, then you're probably thinking, if you haven't got a suspect in that time, it's going to be a long haul.
Well, and you've worked on two of the biggest murder investigations of probably the last century.
Yeah.
So the Yorkshire Ripper case, but also Michael Sands, who murdered a woman and kidnapped the estate agent Stephanie Slater.
Yes.
And you were responsible for actually securing his conviction. Was that one of those cases that you became completely consumed with?
Oh, yes. Michael Sands was a one-legged toolmaker from Newark. And, of course, we were investigating the Julie Dart murder from Leeds. And during the course of that, it became linked with the case of Stephanie Slater, who was an estate agent who was kidnapped, and a ransom of $175,000 was demanded. It became apparent to us, because we did looked at similar facts between all the cases, that it was the same man. I have to say our colleagues in West Midlands weren't as convinced. But so we could see a route to our killer through that investigation.
What happens in that situation where if they thought it wasn't him, you thought it was? How do you take that forward?
Well, it doesn't matter, because if we find him, we then decide, is it our man or isn't it our man? But we were pretty convinced that it was. I mean, I went down to a meeting with my Chief Constable, Peter Nobbs, to see the Chief Constable of West Midlands. And they asked me in the car, I said, how certain, did my chief, how certain are you that this is the same man? I said, I'm 95% certain. So I said, very wise. He said, you couldn't go 100%, could you, without forensic or fingerprints? So, we sort of piggybacked off their investigation because there wasn't a lot coming out of their investigation that was important to us, but we linked computers. And we had officers working on their investigation from my incident room. And, of course, they decided that there were some quite critical features that this would be good for Crime Watch. So decided Crime Watch would get an exclusive. Did not go down well with the general media. But this was a package that we needed to put out together in one package. We knew we had an artist's impression. We had the voice where he said, in his Yorkshire accent, have you got the money? We had a very strong railway connection. We needed to put all that package together.
Once that case went out on Crime Watch, what happened?
Well, we had some people in Leeds at an incident room, because the other thing that they put out was that he had a mini metro, a red mini metro, and Vermilion red, to be precise. And mind you, there was a couple of 100,000 of them, so that wasn't going to be a quick avenue. But if we put it all in one package, maybe this will click with someone. And Michael Sands' ex-wife was interested. She thought it might be her ex-husband, but she was out that night, so she recorded it. And when she played it back, she'd seen him at a funeral the week before. It was in the red Mini Metro. The voice she recognised. Yes, he looked a bit like the photo. And she knew he was absolutely mad crazy on trains. There's probably not a railway station in this country he hadn't visited. It was such a railway buff. So she couldn't get through to Crime Watch, so she rang our incident room. We were just closing down for the evening. It was after 11, I think. And the message was put through to me. We hadn't really had anything of any great interest. I mean, lots of calls that had gone to West Midlands. One of my staff came up to me and said, we've had this call from a guy's ex-wife and she lives at Keighley. Right, go see her. So I said, if it's important, ring me anytime during the night. Otherwise, I'll see you in the morning. And next morning, I get in. It was strange because I somehow developed a bit of a limp that morning. And it was a bit frantic in the incident room. And my colleague had come in, two of them who'd gone to see Susan Oak, came in with their day off. So I thought, oh, they're quite keen. So Grogan, the sergeant, said, right, Michael Benjamin Sands. Oh, he's got a record. So he faxed the picture through to the incident room. And as he come out of the machine, he could see the bony, over the eyes structure. And he said, that's just as Stephanie described him. You know, she didn't see much of him, but so he says, right, I'm going down. Right, okay. Yeah, get on with it. So they found his address. West Midlands had the same call from his son, but when his son had said he'd got one leg, they put it down as the lowest priority. So Grogan goes, and during the mid-morning, I get a phone call from the woman detective he'd gone with, Helen Dover, and she said, boss, it's him. It's him. So I said, look, I've got a lot going on here, and my knee's hurting. I said, stop messing me about. I'm not in a mood for jokes. So Grogan went next door and commandeered the phone from the workshop next door to ring me himself. And he just reeled off the list. He said, right. And he said he'd got Beach Boys playing in the car. We've got the cassette. He said the green gloves, gardening gloves, they're in the car. He said, as Stephanie described, the ping, when you went through the door, she said that there was a ring. It was like the doorbell. And she said it got an old-fashioned dial phone, a microwave, and...
So everything Stephanie had described matched?
Everything she had described. He said, it's him. I said, right, take him to the local police station. He said, I don't even know if they've got one. So they asked Michael Sands to take him to the local police station. They found 19,000 plus pounds in a toolbox in the workshop. And he did immediately confess to the kidnapping of Stephanie Slater.
You actually had quite a relationship with Michael Sands. He wrote to you, didn't he? He actually wrote to you personally. Why do you think he did that?
Michael Sands is a very complex person and with a massive ego. And you've got to play on his ego. And when we arrested him, he was taken to Birmingham initially because that's where Stephanie Slater was kidnapped from. But we had him remanded into custody and brought to Millgarth in Leeds, where our victim, Julie Dart, was from. And we then systematically interviewed him, being very careful. I never spoke to him. I never saw him.
That was deliberate.
That was absolutely deliberate.
Why did you refuse to speak to Michael Sands initially?
Well, I had to be the dark, shadowy figure in the background, and he had to deal with the junior officers who would interview him. And if he wanted anything, he'd have to ask them to ask me. You're actually playing a game with a guy, but he's not in the same room as you. And that's why he was a games player. And you could tell that with him.
So you didn't want to feed his ego by speaking to him personally?
Yeah.
As one of the higher ranking officers. You didn't want to give him that kudos, as it were.
Absolutely. I mean, he himself would say, he wasn't caught by a bobby on the beat. He was caught by a detective. And I hate to say that I'm so conceited, but he sort of revered me because only a really good detective in his mind could have caught him. And honestly, I know that that's not the case because it was a team effort.
But he felt in his mind that it would take a top cop to catch a top criminal, as he believed himself to be.
Yes, and he was even proud of the fact that he would be known as Michael Sands. Not as the Yorkshire Ripper, not as the Black Panther, but by his real name. And for him, that was it. But that was his weakness. That was his weakness, and we played on his weakness, which was, you'd go at one place there was a firebomb left. It was false, but. And he said, "Could you make that?" I bet you could, couldn't you? And he goes, "Oh, of course I could."
So he had a really big ego.
Oh,
Would you say, Bob, that that's quite a common thing with these criminals, serial killers, murderers? Do a lot of them have really big egos?
Yes, I think some of them do. Some of them are quiet and they just don't want to talk. But those that do, those are the ones which are easier to crack because their ego is on display, and you've just got to think about, and they will talk themselves into a corner.
Were you ever concerned that you wouldn't be able to nail Michael Sands, that he would get away with it?
I always believed that I would catch him. I always believed that because not only did he murder Julie Dart, he had a couple of goes at extortion, at British Rail, and he'd always come back. I knew he'd come back. So when we thought things were going a bit cool at our end with him, we just made sure all our colleagues in other forces across the country were aware that this guy's going to pop up at some stage. And we think, we want you to tell us because we'll know if he's connected.
It's interesting because Michael Sands had quite an ordinary life, didn't he? He was married, had a business beforehand, and was he in his 30s before he even committed a proper crime?
Yes, he lived near Keighley, but he was associating people who he saw as successful criminals. And he had assets of about £500,000, and we're talking in pre-70s time.
So he was quite a wealthy guy.
Yeah. But then his business started failing, and he saw criminality as a way to get back to the top, put him on top. And he thought things out really well. If he wanted to, if he's asking for some money to be delivered, he'd give you the exact dimensions. Because if he thought there was a tracking device in it, he would put a coin in a bundle of papers cut to the size of that money and see if he could find it with a metal detector. Because that's how... He would not have complicated transmitters, detecting a transmitting signal. Black & Decker detector to find wires in a wall. And that's what he would use. So, he was a toolmaker. He was a heating engineer, and he was a bright guy, but he'd got dyslexia, and
He there were spelling mistakes in the letters he used to write.
and that was his undoing. The fortunate thing for us was, he'd done some spelling tests, which he'd been given phrases which contained the letters that were misspelt. And he misspelt them all. Exactly the same as in the letters. To him, you spell idea, I-D-E-A-R. And, of course, he'd misspell it the same because he thinks that's how it's spelled. And so when we went into, because he sent the threatening letters to British Rail, went in the cell to fetch him out. He's got a dictionary. "You won't catch me out this time," he said.
Wow.
And he then was asked to write these phrases out, and he misspelt them all exactly as he had misspelt them in the letters, because that's how he thinks you do spell them. And once you know things about him, you can adapt your interview technique to deal with and catch him out.
Do you think psychology is a very important part of your job, Bob? Because you almost got to know Michael Sams's character, the way he thought, as a way of way of capturing him.
Yeah, it became very, very apparent with Michael Sands that I needed to get into his mind. I needed to understand what made him tick, because that was the key to how we were going to get. He's not going to answer a question in a fair way. He's going to answer in a way, but we quickly understood he'd answer it in a way which was satisfactory to him, even though we knew that a jury would not believe that. Because he'd say, "All right, I made them spelling mistakes because the other man," because he introduced this other man.
He tried to pretend somebody else had done it.
Yeah. The other man told me to write it that way. He wrote it out and I just copied how he spelt it, and that's why I've misspelt it. Yeah, well, okay, well, tell the jury that and see how they believe that. But everything he blamed on the other man. So there came to a point when we actually had not recovered all the money. And I decided, right, because he was saying, listen, the other man's out there spending the money.
So when you talk about the money, that was he'd asked for
£175,000.
£175,000 from the employers of Stephanie Slater,
Yes.
the estate agents where he worked. And he'd actually asked the manager of the estate agents to go and drop the money as well.
Yes.
And of course that money was dropped, and
some was recovered.
Some was recovered.
Yeah, we found some in his workshop, but there was a substantial part missing. And so it was literally another investigation. I need to find the money, because he sat there smirking in his cell saying, the other man's out there spending the money. And I actually set up two teams. As one team proved the existence of the other man. The other team proved the other man doesn't exist. And they both came together and said the only evidence that this man exists comes from Sands. Yeah, some of it comes from Stephanie Slater, but that's what Sands has told her. But everything comes back to Sands. So when we found the money, I knew that was it.
How did you find the money? Because he'd hidden it, hadn't he?
I was going through the actions one day, and I saw a man with a limp who was seen at a bridge at Stoke Summit. That is the place over the main East Coast line. A lot of train spotters go there. Sam's was an avid train spotter. But it was a foggy, murky day, this. And this was in between Sam's getting the money and Sam's being arrested. I couldn't find any rational reason that it should be him, and it looked like him, because the farmer said he had a limp. So we did an ID parade, and the farmer picked him out. Bear in mind, Sam's lived, at the end of his garden was the main East Coast line. And the only thing that went past Stoke Summit that didn't his end of his garden was a few, goods trains. So they just did burying them. It was there burying the money. So we set up a team to go there. And
How easy was it to find once you got there?
it's extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. Because it's a large area. But we asked forensic and our technical support unit, find me something that will find something that's not in a metal box.
But is that because you thought he's too clever to put it in a metal box? Right.
And they come up with this ground probing radar. And we got this guy who came from Aberdeen. Strange enough, he had only had one leg as well. And he researched the area and he found a box, plastic. It was a plastic seed tray with money in it.
Wow. I mean, how did you feel as the senior investigating officer at that moment when that money was discovered?
I was delighted, but because we'd agreed it was taken to forensic, just lifted out of the ground and gone. And then forensic rang up and they said, you haven't got it all. And then Sam's rang from prison saying, you haven't got all of it.
Really? So he divided the money? Yeah. Oh, my goodness.
So the guy was on his way back to Scotland, so we went back the following day and started digging and probing in the same area, and about 10 feet away, unearthed a gallon ice cream container packed with the rest of the cash.
You must have felt absolutely elated to get that kind of evidence at that stage.
Yes, I did. I lifted it up. I was the one who pushed the fork in. And I had it on the end of the fork, and I just looked up and said, got you now, Sams.
When was the first time you actually met Michael Sands in person?
First time I met him was when, after the trial, at the end of the trial, he was found guilty and it was moved. It was in Winsome Green Prison in Birmingham. And he was moved to Full Sutton near York. And a message was sent, can I go and see him?
And how did you feel when you were, entering the prison on your way to see this man who you'd been hunting for so long? What were your thoughts?
Well, I thought, obviously, he's going to tell us something positive, which thought, that's good, because that means any appeals are going to go out of the window. And they led us down into this large room, and there was just one table and, 4 chairs, and we sat down. I was with one of my colleagues. We sat down on one side, and Sam came in dragging his leg across the floor, he didn't do that all the time, only when he wanted. It was in sympathy mode. That would be the benefit of the prison officers, not ours, because he knew better than that. And he got to the table, and my colleague said, this is Mr. Taylor, Michael. He went, yes, I know who he is. And he put his hand out to shake my hand, and I just said, Michael, I don't shake hands with murderers. And sat down. And then, why did you want to see us, Michael? Well, I saw a piece in the paper, Julie Dart's mum, by her grave, and there's no date on the grave. I want to tell you what day she died, so that can put a date on.
So he almost imagined himself as a killer with a conscience. Was he a killer with a conscience?
No,
what do you think?
No, he wasn't. He was very concerned because Julie Dart, her uncles were boxers, and he had worked out York is a lot nearer to Leeds than Birmingham, and the chances that they might know somebody in that prison. So he thought, I'll come across as a good guy here, but he wouldn't do anything. He also had to have an ulterior motive. So it was an act of self-preservation as far as he was concerned. He doesn't do things out of the goodness of his heart because his heart is stone cold and black.
Now, as part of your job as well, Bob, you have to give evidence in court, or you had to give evidence in court many times. What was it like giving evidence in the Michael Sands trial? Well,
I was the last person to give evidence. Any question that anybody else couldn't answer, I'd pick up. And, of course, so most of the things that they were going to ask me, I knew because they'd asked other people who said, You better ask Mr. Taylor that.
Were you in court the whole time?
I was in court most of the time, yeah.
And were you confident that you were going to get a conviction at that time?
Juries can be fickle, but the judge, Judge Igor Judge, was a good man, a high court judge. So I knew it would be running a tight ship. And at one stage, we'd applied to get some evidence in, and he wouldn't let it go in because he thought it could be prejudicial to Sands, and basically said, and you got enough anyway. So I was very hopeful.
And when that verdict did come in, tell us about that.
Well, we were all facing the judge, Julie Dart's mother, who sadly passed on now. And, my hair just, stood on end because that was the end to a long road. We'd finally got there, and I'd finally, completed my promise to Julie Dart's mum that, I would catch the killer of her daughter.
You must have been so delighted that he was found guilty, but also, I suppose, mixed feelings too. Mixed feelings in terms of it's hard to feel celebratory.
Yes.
Because of the nature of the crime.
Yeah. As far as my team's concerned, it was a job well done, but not given the circumstances that it involved the taking of a young woman's life, an occasion for celebration as such. And they asked me at the end, I was stood outside court, and one of the journalists said, "Why did you do it? Why did you do it? Why did you go to all this effort for Julie Dart?" And I said, we did it for truth. We did it for justice. But we did it for Julie's sake.
That's it's a fascinating story, the Michael Sands investigation, and of course the Yorkshire Ripper. But I mean, are there any others in particular that stand out in your career, that stand out in your mind more than the others, maybe?
Yes, Wendy Speakes.
Tell us about that investigation.
Well, Wendy Speakes was a 51-year-old woman who lived in Wakefield in a through terrace house, end terrace house, and in 1994 she arrived home from work, just another normal day, and a guy forced his way into the house and brutally sexually assaulted her and murdered her in her own home. And an hour before, we had a reported incident of another woman who someone had tried to get into the house. So, it was. We go through the normal routine. I'll say clear the ground around your feet first before, you start going off on a tangent. So we did the routine inquiries, but it quickly became apparent that this was another stranger murder.
And is it true to say that stranger murders are a lot more unusual? Normally, people are killed by somebody they know.
Yeah.
In
I would say,
cases.
4 out of 5, 9 out of 10 murders, there is a connection between the victim and the killer. In time and place, in relationship. But in a stranger murder, as Michael Sands and the killer of Wendy Speakes, there is no known connection between the killer and the victim. So, it's got to be investigated. A bit like the Yorkshire Ripper. There were no relationships between him and his victims. So it's got to be done as, a proper investigation.
Where do you start with that?
Well, you start by looking at the scene and seeing what the scene tells you. So you've got to rip the scene apart, which I did at Wendy Speakes' house. I absolutely tore that house to pieces because the possibilities that the killer had left a print in that house, was such a possibility. We had to find it. I mean, yes, we did have from forensic pathology from her body, we had DNA from semen, and we also found some blood on the bedsheet and on the wall inside the front door. And you couldn't be matched at that time through forensics now. You could match them all up, but you couldn't then.
That technology didn't exist
No.
in those days, no.
So, of course, you then work on the family. And the family were brilliant. A daughter, Tracy in particular, she had 2 daughters. But Tracy, and I still see Tracy today. We're still in contact.
So how did Tracy help you with the investigation?
She told us her mother's routine, literally down to the second. Right, when she came home, she'd have taken her shoes off, right? She'd have put her shoes in the kitchen, by the chair, right? She'd have then gone upstairs, she'd put her slippers on, then gone upstairs, taken her makeup off, and then she'd have picked a paper up off the bed where she'd marked some to watch and some to video, and she'd have gone in the front room and she'd have. So we knew.
So she was so specific with her mother's.
So we knew basically within a couple of minutes what time she got home. So we were able to pinpoint the time fairly precisely that she never got to the point of having a shower because she still had all her makeup on.
Okay.
And so this helped us greatly because that meant when we are going out to the media, we don't want to be saying, has anybody seen anything suspicious in the last 24 hours? If we can say between, a period of time, maybe 15 minutes, then you're going to get more positive results. And so we did. I mean, we did end up.
So did you manage to narrow it down to a 15-minute time frame?
Yeah.
Amazing.
We did, and where we found a man who worked at, the company's not there now, but it was a printing company. He actually saw the man, but he saw the back of his head. But he saw sufficient detail to see that Wendy had slippers on. Yet when she was found, she was wearing these quite gaudy blue mules, which daughters to this day say, my mother wouldn't have bought them. So we can never be convincing of whether he brought them with him or whether she did actually buy them, because the shoes were pulled out of the shoe cupboard downstairs, and it's quite possible that they could have been in the back of there. But there's another thing. Which
didn't you introduce a psychologist as well at
this
stage?
Richard Badcock, yes, very good. And other things. The room where she was actually attacked was a spare room. And there were a pair of black court shoes, ladies' shoes, on the dresser. And so Tracy said, my mother wouldn't do that. He's taking them in there. The mother, that would be bad luck. You won't put shoes on a table, on a dresser, things like that. So, and he'd also left black stockings, which he'd used. Apparently, he had them in loops to tie her wrists. And
so you knew you were dealing with sort of a fetish,
yes,
fetishist.
Yes, a fetish is mainly, rather nearly exclusively, a male thing. So. I don't know why, but it is, and a shoe fetish is the second most popular. So that took me into some strange areas when we did research into that. And I remember my wife saying to me the night before we went to arrest him, are you sure about that shoe fetish? I said, yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm happy. Because it had made me look a little bit silly.
She was worried about how you would look if you were going down the wrong route.
That's one of the avenues I went down, but yeah, he did admit it, John. He didn't admit it readily.
How did you catch him, Bob? What was the key piece of evidence?
The key evidence was a partial fingerprint. The computerised system, right, for storing fingerprints from crime scenes and fingerprints from people who have been arrested and had the prints taken was on a computer system which is based in Tacoma in America. Not all of the forces were using it at the time of Wendy's murder, so we had to check a lot of forces manually. But as time went on, more and more went on. But you can only put a whole fingerprint on. What you have to do with a partial fingerprint is search it. Now, in the 6 years between Wendy's murder and the guy being arrested, for 4 of those years, he wasn't on the system. But more importantly, for 2 years he was. And they were searching for 2 years, but they would pick out different definition and search every month. He never came out in the top 100. And then one day he comes out on number 1.
Wow.
They do a manual search on his print. It's him. It's good enough for court. And so I get a phone call. And then it was just a matter of finding out, doing a profile on the guy and finding him and arresting him.
Who was the murderer
It was a very, very ordinary person called Christopher Farrer that nobody would be worried sat next to him on a bus or a train. Absolutely looked, uninteresting. But unfortunately, at the time of the murder, his wife, who was pregnant, wouldn't allow him to have sex. So
that was his motive.
Not like a normal person who just goes, "Oh yeah, well,
I can
fine
wait."
with you on that." Yeah, he went out and attacked somebody.
I mean, it's interesting what you say about he looks so ordinary. I mean, what does a murderer look like?
Well, look in the mirror. You don't know. I mean, as somebody once said, a piece of art was a mirror, where the person said, and it said the most dangerous person. And you look in your mirror and you see yourself. So we've all got that potential, but it's what is going on behind the eyes. But there generally are a few things that give away some signs as to, a true personality. I mean, such as Christopher Farrer. I mean, he used to get his first wife to dig the garden in high-heeled shoes. When he was arrested, there is quite a well-known, and it's a shoe fetish picture, and it's just the legs of a woman from, like knees down in red shoes.
Okay.
That was under his mattress. So, there are giveaway signs, but when we spoke to his first wife and said, and he looked like the woman A, he looked like the e-fit she'd made. When we spoke to his first, didn't you think he looked like that? And didn't the fact that we were saying we thought he had a shoe fit? Oh, yeah. Why didn't you bring him in? He'd never been to Wakefield as far as I knew. Simple as that. And that is another reason why the media are so important.
Do you think that relationship between the police and the media is essential?
It is essential. It's essential.
It can be quite a difficult relationship, I would imagine.
It can, but if managed right, with trust and knowing that the person you're dealing with is will do the right thing, then that's fine. I can't get my message out. I put it out to other police officers, but how do I get it out to the public? And also, if I need to warn people of the dangers and give them details of a potential suspect, I need the media, and that's for the public safety aspect.
I mean, sometimes the media are deliberately left out. Why would that be?
I think there's some of police just don't trust the media, and they are the ones who, for a few, rogue journalists giving the majority of journalists a bad name, are losing out because you've got to trust your local journalists. They have no reason. You've got to trust them, and it's got to be a reciprocal arrangement.
One that can be advantageous
To both sides,
to
yes.
both sides. I mean, some of the things you've experienced, Bob, over the years, you've seen some very tough, difficult scenes. How do you manage to cut that off in your private life? How do you manage to switch it off in your mind?
I don't think you ever switch it off completely. I mean, even now, 20 odd years after retirement, there's certain things I can remember vividly. Your first time when we walked into Sam's workshop, it's like a picture that's emblazoned in my memory. The first time I walked into Wendy Speakes' home in the afternoon, it was pouring down with rain. I can just relive it exactly how it was. And, these things don't go away from you, but you manage them.
What would you say to people who are thinking about a career in the police force these days? What would your advice be to them now?
Well, it's not the job it used to be, in the sense that it's diversified into so many different ways that I don't currently think that probably we're serving the public in the best way we could.
Why do you think that?
Police don't investigate things now. I mean, the one force who said, we're going to investigate every crime. Well, I'm sorry, but the majority of the public thought you were doing that anyway. And, so that disappointment, and if it's on the too hard to do list, then, because there's so many other pressures on the police, I still think it's a career. I won't last 2 minutes if I joined today. Probably wouldn't be politically correct enough.
A lot more red tape?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And but I've got relatives now. I had no family in the police when I joined, but there's quite a few of my family I've joined since I joined. And, so, yeah, fine.
I mean, you reached the absolute top of your game in the police force. What would you say it takes to reach the top like you did nowadays?
Well, nowadays, there are still opportunities, and there's still a CID there to go in, and there's still people being murdered. So, yeah, there are opportunities for someone who wants to do that and is prepared to give that commitment, that this isn't a job that you can turn off at 5 o'clock, go home, shut down your computer and forget about till the next day. It's going to live with you for weeks and haunt you until you actually get a result. But yeah, great job.
Did you have a mentor when you were younger, when you started out? I mean, I ask my guests, who means business to you? Who really inspires you in your career and in what you do? Was there somebody who fulfilled that role to you?
I mean, I think the people who inspired me as a young detective were my head of CID. He was Dennis Hoban. He had a trophy named after him by the media because he had a good relationship. The Dennis Hoban Trophy, which was awarded to an outstanding detective every year. I was the most senior officer to ever receive that award when I was superintendent. He had time to talk to you. He never dismissed you. He was a fair guy, and he was the archetypal detective. If he saw something unfolding in the street, he wouldn't be walking away. He'd be getting involved. So, yeah, I mean, in the modern times, I would say somebody like Steve Jobs, would be someone who I greatly admire.
Have you read his book?
Yeah, I've got his book, yes.
Yeah. Why do you admire Steve Jobs?
I think he achieved so much, and, it was cutting edge, what he was involved in. The computerization and computers have changed the world, not just the home's computer, but in a general sense now. We walk around with a phone, which is a little computer in our pocket. We can access so much information, but he also had a good business head. And, it's important to have the two. It's like, even as a senior investigating officer, you've got a budget. So it's not just about catching the criminal, it's about catching the criminal within a budget. So you've got to be able to manage all sides of it. And I enjoyed it. I really did.
Do you find, I mean, you've retired from the police force now. Do you find it hard to almost switch off still in terms of you're interested in the crimes that you see on TV? Do you still kind of try and work out what the situation is with crimes that you see advertised on TV and so on?
Yes, I do. I watch the media and I'll start thinking about what's happened here. I mean, Nicola was one, which intrigued me. The lady who was found in the river. They do intrigue me, yes, because it does spark up your interest. What would I have done in those circumstances?
What did you think of that investigation? It took them a while to find her, didn't it?
It did, because, again, they used people who promised, if she's in this river, we'll find her, and they didn't. And secondly, unfortunately, created some unwanted backlash by disclosing some personal aspects of her life, which I would have never disclosed. Never. I would never, with Julie Dart, I would never, ever confirm that she was a prostitute. I would say she knew people who lived within that area and she was seen within that area. But because she's just turning people off. And,
So it's being aware of the kind of information that you release.
Yeah. I know that I would lose the trust of the family if I did that. And, of course, it's not... I ask myself, where does it take you by giving that information? Does it advance your case any further? No. Only if you want to convince a coroner that, she... Well, that's okay, because she can do that to the coroner. You don't have to do it in the media.
Interesting. Bob, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you about some of the cases that you've worked in and your career. And thank you so much for coming in and chatting to us on Success Means Business.
Absolute pleasure.